My name is Andrea Allen, and I'm president of the Alumni Association. Thank you for joining us this evening for our session, Social Workers on the Front Line of the ECHO Pandemic in Family Law, Enhancing Children's Voices, Safety, and Well-Being, with Professor Michael Saini. I'd like to start by sharing a land acknowledgement as we are here on borrowed land. We acknowledge the City of Toronto as the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now the home of many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We all have a responsibility to be active players in decolonization, of which we're currently enacting by learning, showing up, and staying informed about the needs and desires of our Indigenous comrades. It has not been an easy road. The pandemic has shown us all more than many of us thought we would see. The differential impact of COVID is a highlight of some of the extraordinary circumstances that many of us live in. I'd also like to acknowledge people like myself who were brought across the Atlantic without being given a choice. People who were brought on the transatlantic human trade ship. I wish to acknowledge that other nations who came to this land by choice through colonialism, of which some forgot that they are settlers. We give thanks to the Indigenous ancestors for their patience, but acknowledge that it has been exploited. If we could now take 5 seconds and reflect on where we currently are situated as we are each in different locations, and continue our reflections after this evening's event. 5 seconds, please. Thank you. So I'd like to introduce our guest this evening. It is Professor Michael Saini. Michael Saini is a professor that holds the endowed Factor-Inwentash Chair in Law and Social Work and is a co-director of the combined JD and MSW program with the law faculty at the University of Toronto. Dr. Saini has generated new knowledge regarding the assessment of co-parenting, the complexities of strained parent-child relationships, and the impact of interpersonal conflict and crossover cases between child welfare and family law. He is a board member of the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, Access for Parents and Children of Ontario, Family Mediation Canada, the Canadian Coalition of the Rights of the Child. He is an associate fellow at the International Academy of Family Lawyers and a consultant to the National Center of State Courts. In 2019, he was awarded the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts Stanley Cohen Distinguished Research Award, sponsored by the Oregon Family Institute. Join me in welcoming Professor Saini as he enlightens us and shares with us social workers on the front line of the ECHO pandemic in family law. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for that very nice warm welcome. And thank you for your land acknowledgement. And I appreciate the context and the the depth of your acknowledgement and the the offer for us to reflect, and I think it's really meaningful. So thank you for all of this. So also thank you for being in your position with the alumni. I graduated from my master's program from the faculty 2 decades ago, and have been continued to be involved with the faculty. I love this faculty, and I'm just really happy that the Alumni Association is so strong and vibrant and has great leadership. So I really appreciate everything that you're doing for the alumni, and I appreciate the alumni and this opportunity to be able to come together virtually for now, hopefully in person in the near future, and this opportunity to showcase different works, different projects, different ideas that are taking place. Mine is going to be focused on the echo pandemic. I'm going to go through what that actually means in the context of family law, understanding that there's been multiple pandemics that have been going on in the past couple of years, specifically that have been brought to light, and that I'm going to specifically focus on children and their parents as they navigate family transition, especially separation and divorce, and talk about what that looks like. It is an area that we don't talk a lot about in social work. It's often considered to be a legal issue, and the lawyers deal with the separation, even though it's a very common occurrence, even though we know that the impact on families can be quite damaging, and even though social workers on the front line can create wonderful opportunities for growth and for healing. And so I'm hoping by the end of this talk today that I will painted a picture of where social work, I think, fits in within this context of family transitioning, and the various ways that social workers themselves can be engaged in this process of healing and addressing family transitioning as families try and manage equilibrium, or try to get to a place of equilibrium beyond family breakdown. So what is this echo pandemic? It may be a term that you have heard something about in the last year to 2 years. There's been calls about there being an echo pandemic related to mental health and its crisis beyond the pandemic. And the definition of the echo pandemic, I think, refers to the various peripheral resulting crises, including mental health, that are going to be happening more and more frequently as we become in the position where we are moving out of the pandemic. We keep on thinking we're moving out of the pandemic. It hasn't happened yet. And there seems to be continuing, we keep on moving, and the expectations of when we're going to get out of this pandemic, but it looks like to be optimistic that we are making some gains. Having said that, I know that I coach 2 girls hockey teams, and every day there's new players who are reporting having COVID and not being able to participate in games and practices. So we are not out of anything yet. But as we start to move out of the pandemic, and as we see the restrictions lifted, and especially in places like Ontario, where we have gone through some of the most strict lockdowns, if you will, compared to other places, this has had a dramatic impact on us as a society, and as individuals, and as families. And it has changed and disrupted our understanding of what the status quo was, and it has had an impact on our ability to connect with others, and our sense of identities, and how those identities have been influenced by the pandemic. There's been a lot of COVID-19 related stressors that have been identified in the literature, everything from unemployment to child school closures, the lack of childcare when parents have been working from home, the financial security insecurities, people losing jobs, not having the ability to pay ongoing bills, illness of a loved one. By this time, most people have experienced people in their family who has experienced COVID, hopefully mild, but not always the case. And perhaps there's been a death of a loved one due to COVID or because of COVID. We know that, for example, as hospitals have been prioritizing higher risk cases of COVID, there's been lots of other issues, like life still goes on, and so there's been a lot of consequences that have come from COVID. And then separation from loved ones due to travel restrictions, not being able to get the support from grandparents, for example, has had a huge impact on families. Families have been more isolated than ever before, and individuals within these families have been isolated, and loneliness is a huge problem now. And we see now there's lots of studies that are starting to take shape on the study of loneliness. And it is a huge issue in our society. And we need to grapple with what loneliness means and how it impacts us. So the indirect impacts of these public health measures, specifically to family law issues, is what I've been interested mostly during this pandemic. So here's a quote from Raman and colleagues. It talks about the public health measures that, one hand, have prevented disease, but especially when it comes to children, at what cost? When they have not been able to socialize with their peers at school, when they haven't been able to go to extracurricular activities, when they haven't been able to be involved in opportunities to connect outside of their homes. And this is really important for children, especially when these homes have not been necessarily safe for them. So the idea of shelter in place means that hopefully that shelter is a safe place. But we have been finding more times than not that shelter in place doesn't always equal safety for many children and families. And so the impact of social distancing, when we have schools closed and there's a park across the street when the pandemic first began that had yellow tape around the playground to signal that it's off, that it's closed. And so the signal is that, there is no place outside of the home that is unsafe. But when the home itself is unsafe, when the home itself is not a place that children feel they're able to thrive in because of family conflict, family violence, when the uncertainties of the family dynamics. And these children have remained silent because of court closures, because not going to school, not having, not being visible to the community. And the impact this has had on these children has been devastating for some. So the impact, we know generally speaking that in times of crisis, there's an escalation of family violence. And so we're always on high alert for the presence of inter-partner violence and child abuse and the impact that family stress has on families. There's a heightened risk of exploitation of children, especially when schools are closed, and especially when children are not visible to their communities. When the only time we see children is through virtual, through this box that we're all stuck to. And so, having opportunities early on in the pandemic to try and create more opportunities to take children out of these isolated states has been really important, and the movement towards trying to get back to school has been important. This feeling of isolation, stress, anxiety, mood disorders, sleep issues, PTSD, emotional burnout, just not being able to sleep on a routine schedule has been tough. I have teenagers, and trying to get them to bed at a half decent time during the pandemic, it's starting to get better now, but it has been a real big challenge with my own sleep, their sleep habits. I mean, it's very common, these problems, but especially more problematic for situations where families have not been in a healthy place, and where the pandemic has exacerbated or has created additional problems within families, especially when there's been families at greater risk of mental health problems related to the pandemic or exacerbated by the pandemic. And when these consequences are showing up now, but we're finding that these may persist for months and years to come. And so we start seeing this, and this is something that this is, we're not new to social work. We know to be expecting mental health problems come out of the pandemic, and we're seeing it in our practice. We're seeing it with the families who we support and advocate for, to ensure that they end up with better services. So the socio-ecological impact of COVID-19 has impacted individuals and societies. So at the child level, we talked about the heightened risk of child abuse. At the family level, higher rates of separation and divorce, higher rates of violence, fear of the disease, disruption of the family. At the community level, a breakdown of trust, conflicts, limited access to services creates these conflicts where now we're competing for spaces. At the societal level, there's an erosion of social capital. We don't have each other in a supportive way because of social distancing. And then at the sociocultural norms, we've seen stigma against certain ethnic groups. We've seen multiple pandemics. We've seen the lack of equal distribution of support and services. We've seen further marginalization, and so it's the impact of COVID-19 has been throughout, and more specifically, my focus has been on the impact as it relates to child protection and family law. And we know that, specifically COVID-19 has had direct impact on family breakdown. So we saw that, first of all, we saw it in China. We saw the rates when they were locked down. We saw the rates of separation and divorce go up. And then we saw those rates continue across the globe as we went into social distancing mandates to try and protect against the virus. And again, for some, it's been wonderful. We've been doing studies about co-parenting during the pandemic. And for some families, this has been a great time for family cohesion. That for the first time in a long time, families have been able to spend more time together, that they've been able to have dinners together at the dinner table without people running all over the place. And so for families where it's been positive, there's been this increased sense of bond. But for those where it's been more stressful, we see higher rates of violence, higher rates of abuse, higher rates of financial and mental health issues. And we see that this has been really troubling because there's at the same time a lack of services for families during this time. We know that divorce, separation is considered to be one of the adverse childhood experiences. It doesn't have to be, but it can be listed as an adverse childhood experience, specifically depending on how the parents themselves negotiate their separation. If children are caught in the middle of their parents' dispute, then it's going to have more of an impact. And so we know that separation and divorce, family transitioning is very common for children. It is a common adverse childhood experience, probably the most common of all the ACEs. And I think though at the same time, because it's so common, it gets less attention. Separation and divorce is often a factor that we consider among a bunch of other factors and not a factor in itself. And so we don't have a lot of services specifically addressing children's coping of family transitioning. We'll have school programs that also bring in a component that is related to separation and divorce, but it's often done in a more indirect way rather than addressing separation and divorce as a public health issue. Again, it often, well, this is clicking fast today. It often becomes a legal issue, or at least it's perceived to be a legal issue rather than a social work public health issue, which I think it needs to be. So it's not the separation itself that can be problematic for children. It's often the parental conflict, the way that the parents are able or unable to resolve their differences, and children get caught into the alliances, they get caught into the conflict, and this has an emotional toll on children as they try and navigate these complex relationships. When parents are consumed with their own conflict, they find it difficult to give attention needed for their children's healthy overall development. This is called the spillover effect. And they're unable to contain their own emotions, and they bring their children into the conflict, whether consciously or unconsciously, whether on purpose or not. Children end up being caught between their parents' conflict. When there's been domestic violence, children are exposed to this violence and are negatively impacted by the violence. And there's research that shows that it may be 10 years later before you start seeing the consequences in children's internal and externalizing behaviors and in their emotional development. And so even though, and this is really hard for child welfare because I do a lot of consultation with child welfare agencies, and you know, when there's emotional harm, it's really hard to assess what emotional harm looks like for that specific child. We know that emotional harm is generally considered if they're caught in their parents' conflict, but what does that look like, and how to relate that to the eligibility spectrum, and how to relate that to the definition of emotional harm within legislation. And there's a disconnect there because children may not look like they are being harmed in their parents' conflict because they don't have those signs and indicators that are outlined in legislation. I mean, the most serious cases, yes. I mean, one of the easiest cases to determine the psychological harm to a child is I had a child who was pulling out his hair, and he had clumps of hair missing from his head that he was pulling out because of the stress. But yeah, that's easy to figure out. But a lot of this is internal. A lot of this is really hard to figure out, and it doesn't show up until later in life. And we need to be really careful about the impact this all has on children. Children are harmed when they're made to choose between their parents, either directly choosing, like, who do you want to live with, or indirectly, those alliances. I tell parents, I do groups for separated divorced parents for the university through the family care office. And I tell parents that the most challenging time for many children who are in separated family dynamics isn't the time that they spend with one parent or the other, but it's transitioning from one parent to the other, because then they have two worlds that collide. And when they feel these alliances, this creates an awful lot of stress on children, and they pick up on these alliances even in their most subtle ways. When children are questioned about the other parent, and from a parent's perspective, you're just asking questions. You're saying, what did you do at your other parent's home during the weekend? But for the child, it seems more that you're interrogating. What did you do at the other parent's home? The tone of voice, because these parents are often emotionally raw, that emotion comes through in that the way they ask questions. And the children who are extremely hypersensitive to these alliances pick up on this in very subtle ways. Parents make promises that they don't keep. I'll see you on Friday, but then you don't show up. They drop in a child's life, and it's extremely challenging for the children because it's the fear of abandonment. It's a fear of not knowing what life is going to be like post-separation. And then the parents fight in the courts, and they're too busy arguing back and forth of who's going to win the litigation. Meanwhile, these children don't have the opportunity to cope and heal through this process. Children beyond separation, divorce, really to get at equilibrium, need to be able to emotionally heal from that process. They need to deal with the loss just like the parents do. Even if the parents don't like the other parent, they still need to grieve the symbolic representation of what that person, what that family meant to them. And so they need to work out this grief process. Children often have to work out their guilt process. They often feel guilty. They don't understand why their parents separated. And children are often not told the details of the separation. And I don't mean like the raw details. I just mean like that the parents were even separating. All of a sudden they're going to two different homes, and like, I don't know how this all happened. So then the kids start trying to figure out, well, what happened? What did I do? Maybe it's because I didn't clean up my room. Had I cleaned my room, my parents will still be together. And so they have to work out this guilt. One of the things that we can do for children is hear their voices, and two is to normalize their experiences. That it's because they feel there's something wrong with them, and they need to know that this is not about them. This is about their parents unable to work it out. So separation, specifically during COVID, has been extremely challenging for many. The already risk of emotional commotion at the time of separation, it takes about 2 to 3 years for any given family really to get a sense of equilibrium beyond separation. And then you put a pandemic or pandemics on top of this, and now you're in a whole different realm of stress. And so there's been many roadblocks because of court closures. There's been long delays. They haven't been able to get the services that they need in a timely way. At the same time, they're trying to deal with two different homes, or where they're going to live, or what the job situation is going to be like, and then issues around child support and spousal support and all those other decisions that need to be made. At the same time, they're stressed about not having a job or losing their job, or not being able to have the financial ability to continue to manage due to the pandemic and all of the stresses financially that this has caused on families. There's been a greater need for communication with their exes. Most of the parenting plans that have been created before the pandemic don't actually address these pandemic-related stresses. So what do you do when the child has been tested for COVID and tested positive and is told to isolate? Does that mean they should not go to the other parent's home? What if the parents don't agree with vaccination? Do they always need to go to court to have that settled? And will the court provide you, the parents, with the instructions of how to proceed? And the answer to that is no. I mean, there's been some court cases across Canada that have shown that vaccination has been typically considered to be the best interest of children. And we've seen actually cases where the courts have limited the time that a parent spends with their child because they refuse to vaccinate the child. But then there's been a recent case in Hamilton where the court went the opposite way and said, actually, it's a case-by-case basis, and vaccination isn't always the best interest of the child, and it needs to be done at an individual analysis. And so it doesn't leave families any more clear about how to proceed in these situations, and parents don't have the resources to be able to respond to these conflicts, because these conflicts are not something that they've had to deal with ahead of time. And so there's no planning in place of how to deal with vaccinations and peer connections. Like if one parent wants the child to have a sleepover, but then that sleepover is against government mandates for social isolation or social distancing. And so now the parents are in conflict because there's always, for these conflicts, I find in my experience working with families, is that there's often I wouldn't say always, but often a different level of risk tolerance. And so some parents are extra careful to protect their children, and some parents are more laissez-faire about how they respond to these pandemic-related issues. So the echo pandemic in the family courts, basically with everything being shut down and there being social isolation and the impact that this has had on families. So you see an increase of separation and divorce, an increase of domestic violence, an increase of family stress. At the same time, you have a lack of services that are able to respond to these families as they're looking for help from social work and lawyers and judges and others in the family law sector. At the same time, courts were already dealing with backlogs and long delays. And so now what you end up with this echo pandemic where we're now at a apex of court usage. Well, we're moving towards an apex of court usage. We see more and more families looking towards the courts to try and resolve their parenting plan disputes, the vaccination disputes, parenting time issues around decision making and so on. And the courts are just further backlogged than ever before because of the court shutdowns, because of the social isolation mandates, because we don't have a really good plan in place of how to address this backlog. And so what we're seeing now is this real innovative, creative way of trying to flatten the curve, if you will. We used to talk about flatten the curve in terms of the pandemic, and now we're talking about in terms of how to flatten the curve of the apex of court usage. And so trying to have more triage. I'm part of a number of initiatives in Miami. They have a triage program that they're starting where they're looking at moving folks into different clusters of services based on their needs. So a triage is basically if you're low conflict and you have no risk of violence and you're able to and you're amenable to resolving your agreement and you just need a stamp from the judge, well, then you go into this line and you get quick services. If you need some additional services, but you're not high risk, you just need to be guided towards resolution, well, then you would get mediation, maybe 6 sessions of mediation, maybe some more targeted interventions to assist with resolving the parenting plan. And then if you're high conflict, or if there's violence, or if there's high risk issues, well, then you would get a wraparound approach of having a judge provide the structure that's needed. So ensuring that orders are enforced, like any restraining orders or anything to keep the parties safe, the children safe. And then you'd also have a wraparound of services. So you'd have social workers providing interventions to work with the families who are involved in high conflict. You would have support with folks from substance, the substance misuse fields. You would have mental health services attached. And so there's a real big focus on mental health in the courts and how better to address mental health within the family courts. And we've seen that in problem-solving courts in the US, drug courts in the US, and we're starting to see this movement towards bringing in the issues around mental health into the family courts within a therapeutic jurisprudence, which I think is a huge step forward for assisting families who are looking for support and not currently getting the support that they need. Because of course, the court deals with these issues from a reasoned perspective. But most families who are going through separation divorce are not necessarily reasoned, especially the higher conflict folks. They're more emotionally connected to the fears, worries, and concerns. You look at vaccination, for example. Vaccination is probably not the best place to deal with this in the courts, because the courts are just going to say, well, this or that. It doesn't address the fears, worries, and concerns of parents. And so mediation and social workers involved in working with families about these issues can really provide people the opportunity to tell their story and to really to address the concerns and worries that are keeping them engaged in the conflict. So the role of social work is critical as the echo pandemic and family law takes shape. We're going to need more and more social workers to assist in helping folks transition out of the COVID global pandemic and dealing with family instability, to deal with children who are coping with all the stresses that have been associated with COVID or related to COVID, in addition to the family stresses that have been happening with family transitioning. And so the role of social work is critical. From a social work perspective and family law, and again, I really urge my students that I work with to consider the family law sector as an area of social work practice, because I think it's an area that needs more social workers to be involved to provide a social work lens to these issues and to counter often the legal parameters of these issues. I think that's too narrow for families who are dealing with all of these other factors that need to be sorted out. So having social workers involved in a child-centered response to family transition, I think is critical. And I'll talk about what that looks like in a moment. Innovative and differential approaches to respond to the increased pressures on the family courts. So again, I mentioned a project in Miami. There's another project that's doing triage modeling in Connecticut that I'm involved in. There's another program. We just did a presentation about differential response to dispute resolution. So how to do different types of mediation depending on the context of the families. I've worked with Nebraska, for example, to come up with a model specifically for situations where there's domestic violence that uses more of an asynchronous model to work with families. So there's lots of opportunities, both here and abroad, to do wonderful work to assist families move through the separation process outside of the litigation process, or at least being supported by the litigation process, and by providing the additional supports that are needed. Improving access to justice. And access to justice, my favorite quote is from Justice Cromwell's report on access to justice, where the judge stated that access to justice could be as simple as giving a bus ticket to increase the accessibility for families, for individuals to have access to these services, to have access to the justice system, to better meet their needs. But it needs to be done in a trauma-informed way that deals with diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's much, and for good reason, concern about the justice system, and whether justice system itself is an oxymoron, whether there's any justice at all in that system. And I think it's important that using a diversity, equity, and inclusion approach, that there would be much more focus on increasing diversity and representation within both the legal field generally, but also in terms of social work's role in these issues, and creating more opportunities for individuals and families to receive services that are based on equity and inclusion, and that going through a family transition, like a separation, divorce, that they're able to be assisted by social workers from diverse backgrounds, and from diversity, from backgrounds that match their own experiences, so that there's opportunities to get different types of services, rather than some of the current services that are in place that are too narrow and not diverse. And then harvest the strength and help to navigate through families through crisis, using a trauma-informed perspective, helping families to feel safe, empowered, making sure that the process is transparent, that both parents and children have choice. And I think, one way that social work can specifically be involved is helping to be an alternative to litigation. Going to court is not good for children, not good for parents. And we have services that social workers do an incredibly good job doing. I teach family mediation at the university, and we keep on getting more and more social workers with mediation training, and hopefully that will improve the opportunities for families to access social work services for mediation rather than going to the court. So their first call should be to a social worker and not to their lawyer. When we look at children's rights, even though the UN Convention, we talk about it, and we emphasize these different articles that are so important to children's rights and voices. Article 12, the right to be listened to and to be taken seriously. I mean, this is so important to this work that we do when we work in the context of separation and divorce. Yet there's so many obstacles when it comes to listening to children, especially when parents themselves are driving the litigation. If one parent believes that the child's resistance or rejection towards a parent is due to parental alienating behaviors, then they don't want to listen to the children. They want to dismiss the children as being unable to provide independent views. And I suggest that even in those most complicated, complex situations, we should still be listening to children. Again, there's a difference between voice and choice, but they should still be part of the discussion. And we should not ignore them just simply because they don't agree with what parents are saying. And we need to make sure that we do provide a place at the table for them so that A, that they're more aware of what's going on, and B, that they can provide their input of what's going on. You know, the right of freedom of expression, the right of freedom of conscious thought and religion, the freedom of association, the right of privacy. These are all rights that get violated in the context of separation and divorce because the parents are more worried about their own conflict, their own hurts, their own pains, that that these rights don't get, there's no adherence to these rights. And then the right to education. We've seen this during the pandemic. The lack of opportunity for children to have safe places outside the conflict. And I work a lot with families about creating safe zones away from the parental conflict, which I think is so critical. Whether it be, I coach girls hockey, that's a safe zone. That's where the conflict should never go to, right? School should be a safe zone. You go there to learn, to have fun, to socialize, not there to bring conflict. So I don't want parents picking up their children on, for exchanges at the school. Leave that conflict away from the school. Provide the more safe zones we can create for these children, the more protected they're going to be. So under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the 4 Ps, provisional rights, they have right to basic needs, protection rights, and then participation, and we must promote. So whenever I'm in the US, I'm always reminding them that they have not yet signed the UN Convention of the Rights. That's my duty to promote the importance of the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. So these articles suggest to us some key messages about children. One is that they are people now, not people in the making. So we need to listen to children now and what they have to tell us, because what they have to say is important. That childhood is valuable in its own right and not simply a stage of adulthood. We're too busy now trying to get kids into the best this and the best that, and try to prep. We're now in prep for when they're younger, just so that they're ready for college, university, and children need that time in childhood as a valuable time to socialize, to be kids. And when we look at parenting disputes, when everything else is going on, we need to ensure that we have these safe zones for kids, where they can just be kids, that they're an active agent in their own lives, that they have input, and we should hear what they have to say, that they should not be treated less seriously simply because we don't agree with them. And yes, children and infants are vulnerable, and we should be always mindful of ages and stages. Well, ages and stages and specific chronological age is something that should not dismiss their involvement simply because we say that they're too immature. Even younger children have important information to tell us, and we should listen to children as they go through these experiences. But of course, there's been lots of barriers to implementing the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. One is tokenism. We say, oh yeah, children have the opportunity to have their voices heard in all decisions that impact them. But we actually don't have policies developed for this. In fact, the only way to have children's voices heard in the context of family transitioning, when parents separate and divorce, is through the courts. We have judicial interviewing, we have voice of the child reports, We have child custody evaluations or parenting plan assessments. And those all integrate children's voices. But that's only the 10 or 20% of families that actually that need to go to litigation or do go to litigation to resolve their disputes. What happens to all the other children whose parents are not going to court? So as we think about triaging and helping there be off-roads or off-ramps to get families outside the court, there needs to be equal amount of attention towards how we're going to continually hear the voices of children, even if their parents are not going through litigation. We may consult them on trivial matters, and we don't want to know about, where they want to live. Now, I'm not saying choose between parents, but we need to understand the context of their situation, because we learn more from children by speaking with them. It may be that they have some good friends in the area and they want to stay connected to those friends. And we don't know that unless we ask about those important questions. And of course, when only some children, for only those whose parents can afford litigation, only those who can afford the voice of the child reports and the parenting plan evaluations and those other services that are usually expensive, unless, we're in Ontario, we have the Office of the Children's Lawyer, and they can provide free services if they should accept those cases. But voices should be heard of all children, not just those whose parents can afford it. So using a child-centered family justice approach, I think is a really good step forward, especially during this pandemic. So we minimize potential negative impacts of separation and divorce. And by doing that, we assess the safety of each family member, including the children, including the parents involved. Every family we work with, we need to be screening for intimate partner violence. We know that at the time of separation and divorce, there is a higher risk of violence. And we know that violence and substance misuse are highly correlated at the time of separation. So if you see one, there's a good indication that the other may be there too. And so we're looking for those signs. We're assessing and we're screening and we're providing safety planning to ensure that children and parents are safe during this transition, especially during the time of the pandemic when most things have been closed. We need to do those extra steps to create those safe links to safety. We need parenting plans that provide children and families with safe opportunities, safe zones, safe time with their parents. And we need to ensure that we provide options for parents through the legal system, but also outside of the court services. We need more outside of the court. So if you think of the court, and then you think of, there being a bunch of tents outside the court that parents could go to, that children could go to get additional services from social workers, so they never have to go into the court. That would be the ideal. And we need a process for ensuring that children's voices can be heard, both in court, but also outside of court. The work that I've done with Justice Canada is to try and, so it's identify, how children are heard in the family law sector, but then look for opportunities and build opportunities to listen to children. So child inclusive mediation. We need to see much more mediators prepared to use a child inclusive approach. We need in the schools, when children are going through a separation, school social workers need to be aware of the family dynamics and be able to be ears for children so they have a voice. We need to be working across sectors to ensure that children are better, their voices are being heard throughout these without this transition. And then more services for intimate partner violence, more services for victims of safety, for victims to ensure that they're safe. And there's some really wonderful programs happening in terms of inviting offenders or perpetrators of violence to be accountable for their violence. And I think these are really important steps. So the Caring Dads program, Katrina Scott's program, and others, I think are doing a really good job of providing alternatives to the PAR program and working on ways of inviting perpetrators of violence to be accountable so that they're better able to be part of the solution rather than the problem. So any decision in the family courts needs to be child-centered. And so there's different questions that we need to be asking, right? We need to be asking, how will the decision affect children? Whether it's parenting time, whether it's decisions around school, whether it's vaccination, whatever the question may be, we need to have a child-centered perspective. How will the decision affect children differentially? So knowing that not all children will be affected the same way. So specifically, the children that you're working with, how will these children be impacted? So we take what we know generally from the social science literature, and then we look to see how this may or may not relate at the individual child. And then children's voice, what do they have to tell us? What do they want to say about these decisions? And then we look at children's best interest, and are children's views and their best interest aligned? And if they're not, what do we make of that? And then we report back to children. Always a feedback loop, always involving children in the decision-making process. Oops. In terms of dispute resolution, again, much more attention is needed for child-inclusive mediation and child-inclusive dispute resolution methods. So we need to explore what children say they need. There's the child needs analysis strategy, or there's also the child's best interest tool that you can assess from each situation how this decision-making is impacting children's overall needs and best interest. We want to reduce trauma and the effects of trauma on children as they go through these steps. And we want to communicate with children as key actors. So again, voice and choice is not the same thing, but we do need to ensure that children do have voice through this process, and that there are collaborative key stakeholders in this approach. When we develop parenting plans, when we develop plans for how we're going to address these issues that impact children, that we are, of course, including them into the decision making. And then how do we develop child-centered court-involved children and families? Well, we need to, again, make sure that children are provided a voice to be heard, and at all stages of the process, not just those who are going towards litigation. We need to have neutral assessors, social workers who are able to have direction and authority from the court to listen to children's views, to include children's views in a way that protects them in their relationship with their families, but still provides them the opportunity to have voice. We need to adopt family law rules and procedures that stop the delay. And we see in the Divorce Act, the new amendment, we now have children's voices to be considered as one of the best interest tests, which is a huge step forward. And we need to build on that and continue to find ways to include children's voices. Using the authority of the court to hold parents accountable for their behaviors. And so we need the structure of the court and the support of social workers working together alongside in a collaborative way in the most high-risk situations. And for those who are not high risk, we need to get them out of court as quickly as possible and into other ways of trying to resolve their disputes that does not involve litigation. There are resources here that I put together that have looked at specifically family law matters and COVID. So you can take a look at those. And that is it.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Saini. Thank you. That was most enjoyable and most provocative in terms of the distance we need to go. I really appreciate your comments about the need for trauma-informed approaches in working with family matters, especially engaging the children. I also really enjoyed your reflection on the need for social workers who reflect diverse communities. I also really appreciate the safe zone concept. What an idea, right? For so many years, the school was considered a good place for the transition or the trade-off. And I also really appreciate the child-centered family justice model. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. And as the alumni, we are no longer taking your classes, but this is such a gift and such a treat for us, and reminiscence of what we used to sit and listen to in your class. We can open up for some questions. And before we do that, I'd like to ask everyone to please remember we're recording the session, and so try not to ask specific questions about any situation. Just keep your questions to be general in nature. Are there any questions at this time?
I need to think about my question, but I just really wanted to say, Dr. Saini, listening to you, it really did remind me of my classes with you. There was so much wisdom in what you had to say. And I particularly appreciate you bringing back just the context of what's happening for children within the pandemic. Like there were so many great points that you brought up that I didn't think about. And I guess it's because of where I am in my work. I'm in forensics, yes, but I'm dealing more with adults than I am dealing with the children, and recognizing that, yes, they're going through so much and we do really need to think about them in everything that we're doing. So thank you so much. If I could come up with another question, I will definitely shoot it out, but it's been wonderful hearing from you.
And likewise, it's nice to hear from you as well, Michelle. And let me just say that, although it wasn't your question, but I also work with parents more probably than I do with children, but I do so because I think my role is to really educate parents about how best to consider children's interest, especially during these times, especially in times of family transition. And I think I haven't been on an airplane in years, actually years. It's quite funny. But when I used to be on an airplane, they would say that you put your mask on first before you put the mask on of your child. And I see that type of parent education, parent focus as important to the work that I do, both in my research and also in my clinical practice, because what I'm helping them to do is help them be better able to be attuned to the needs of their children. So I think you're still able to do a lot of this focus, even if you're working with the adults.
Yes, excellent, excellent point. When parents ask me, what do I do if my child's teenagers usually doesn't want to go for counseling? And I say, okay, you go, you start as the parents. Yes, thank you very much. There is a, Julia, you had a comment or a question?
Hi, so I'm actually not Julia, that's my daughter who's also attending
Oh.
this. I'm Amy Mullen. So I'm not a social worker, I'm a philosophy professor here at U of T. And but I work in childhood studies, and I really appreciated your remarks about the distinction between children's voice and children's choice. But I guess I wanted to ask you if you think that there can be a kind of graduated approach whereby, as in kind of shared decision making and in bioethics, that there's some circumstances when it can be appropriate for minor children to make their choice, and some circumstances in which it's just more appropriate to make sure that they're listened to, albeit with respect.
Yeah, I think I think one of the struggles is looking at some of the research and literature when it comes to children's voice, because we know, for example, from the social science research, that children at the age of 14, for example, just to throw that number out there, can make as good as choices as adults. We know that younger children are actually also very competent in providing opinions about decisions that impact them. And so there's lots of opportunity to further showcase the competency and capacity of children. Where I think this is where we struggle is that the one thing that impacts children's voice that has not been studied in those studies is the lack of independence that children can have when it comes to their decision making, where they're being pressured by both sides to come up with a decision making that best, or a decision that best suits one parent or the other, and the stress that has on children can be extremely hurtful and damaging for children as they try and navigate these relationships without severing ties with either parent. And sometimes it becomes too difficult, and they end up taking one side over the other in their disputes simply because they need to adapt to parents who just don't get along. And so I think, yeah, there's lots of opportunity to bring in children into the decision-making process. But I think in the context of separation and divorce, we need to be considering the impact that the parents' pressure, either directly or indirectly, and just overall feelings of alliance in these disputes, and how that impacts their decision-making.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a question from our dear Sylvia. Hey, Sylvia Pisco. Sylvia is asking that you mentioned several creative, innovative programs in the US. Are there any in Canada?
So nice to see you, Sylvia. So at this point, there's been some progress. I was involved in a justice reform in Nova Scotia, where we moved towards an early differential approach. In Ottawa, they did a pilot study. Where we did we evaluated their pilot study in Ottawa of a wraparound where they had the OCL, the Office of Children's Lawyer, they had mediators, they had other people around the family in higher levels of conflict to provide that support. So we are seeing those different types of approaches. I've worked with folks in Saskatchewan, and I'm in BC. There's some interesting things going on. I mentioned the ones in the US because I think those are moving along further. They have the backing of the National Center of State Courts, which is a national organization in the US that is putting both financial support and time into helping these state courts move into these pilot programs. We don't have necessarily national funding for this in Canada. And it's hard to get funding to do research on separation divorce. As I mentioned, it's not something that gets often funded. It is considered to be a common problem. It's like a common cold. It's like trying to get research on the common cold when everybody else is getting research on COVID. It's just, you're not going to get the dollars to do that. And I think until we consider separation divorce a public health issue, and specifically the way I'm looking at it right now is that given that it has been identified as an adverse childhood experience, and again, I'm not saying that separation isn't automatically an adverse childhood experience, but it could be if not managed appropriately. And so to me, this is our way in to really try and change the opportunities for further promoting these programs across Canada.
Wow, Canada still has much to learn from the United States.
In some areas, but not others.
Some
I mean,
areas.
the one thing that we have lots of great programs, look at Ontario specifically, we have supervised access programs to keep children and families safe in every single court district in Ontario. And during the pandemic, where other services stumbled, many of these services quickly went into virtual supervised programming and offered families the opportunity to stay connected with their children in a supervised virtual format, which is incredible. They were able to pivot so quickly. We have the Office of Children's Lawyer that provides parenting plan assessments and voice of the child reports, and really helps to bring in children's voices. And when they're involved in child protection, they represent automatically children in those cases to ensure that their voices are heard in child protection issues. So we have a lot going on, but I'm talking specifically about interventions for assisting families who are stuck in conflict. And we need a lot more attention on those services.
Yes, yes. I do not have any other questions in the chat. Is there anyone else who has a question to ask before we end the evening? Your presentation was so thorough. Most of us, as myself, we're still thinking. There's much to think about. Michelle said, what did you say, Michelle? The triaging process sounds very effective. Is it safe to assume this will continue? And has this increased mediation work with families? I have certainly seen greater efficiency in how criminal court matters are managed as a result of the pandemic. From Michelle English. Yes,
and I think that's a great point, and I think I've seen that in alternatives to sentencing and in other ways. We see a lot of actually great work happening. Still lots to happen, but I think of some of the new initiatives in the criminal court side of things, to really try and infuse therapeutic jurisprudence, to really infuse mental health awareness, to really infuse the fact of overrepresentation of Indigenous and Black youth and adults in these systems, and how to figure out systems to better address outside of the litigation. We are coming to terms with the idea that the courts are not the best place to deal with many of these issues, and that we need to have social workers at the front line really helping to push alternatives to litigation, alternatives to courts, to provide other ways of dealing with these complex, complicated issues within a trauma-informed perspective, within a more sensitive approach, within a more a lens of diversity, equity, inclusion, by using alternative means such as mediation. And so I think we'll continue to see more of these opportunities for growth, and I applaud all of the efforts. It's complicated stuff to do triaging and how, because we're asking the courts to act very differently than they previously acted, but it's important work, and I think, you know, we as social workers, we have an important role to keep on promoting these changes.
Thank you so much. Indeed, it's one of those areas that we take for granted. It's commonly occurring, so we think it's just the way it is, but you're right, there's much to be done.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this, spending your evening with us. And people are giving you their thank yous in the chat.
Thanks, Corey.
And, yes, and we hope you'll come again down the road to the Alumni Association. It feels like a reunion when we come together. And so we thank you very much for joining us this evening. And thank you for your words of wisdom, your knowledge, your experience, your insight, the concept of eco-pandemic. Yeah, thank you very much. Have a great evening.
Bye, everybody.